when we talk about structures, the structural racialization, we recognize the need, everybody's recognizing the need to work on structure, right? And the ones that maintain these racialized outcomes. And we can look at the policies, we've looked at some of the policies that produce these outcomes. We had some discussion about the retrenchment that occurs because we're aware that these policies, these efforts that we make are situated in larger structural forms that push back against them and make it hard to keep, maintain the gains we've gotten and even sustain that for the future. And we see that this is a widespread problem. I mean, we see this in the current financial industry where we've had this economic meltdown. We've responded with all kinds of little policy changes like, controlling executive pay and making some rules about derivatives. And what happened? Well, the financial industry managed to come up with new forms of financial instruments, new ways to get around the compensation packages, and they're getting bigger ones. Obama's saying, well, we need to get back to the Glass-Steagall Act and separate and break up these big banks. I don't know how successful he'll be, but you can see what we're up against, a whole structural form that is bigger than these little parts that we're working on. So if we're really going to reform and change structures, we have to understand the nature of structures themselves. So structures. What do we know about the properties of structures? That's what I'm going to talk about today. And what are the structures, how are structures enacted? That is, created or recreated. And what are the mechanisms that reinforce structures? And how might structures be changed? So we have to start with social systems. Social scientists tell us that social systems are patterned social practices. That's what most social scientists mean by societies. They range from large, some global social units like the capitalist world system to smaller units like the neighborhood community. They really don't have any existence apart from the practices that constitute them, right? They're just, it takes people to enact them, to make them happen. And the practices are reproduced by the recursive enactment of structures. It's not just that there's a system and we have all these arrows connecting them, but the nature of that interaction, this recursive enactment. So what do we mean by recursive enactment? I think you know, but I'm going to stress it more because Susan's been bringing it up. What does that mean? It means that structures shape practices, and practices constitute reproduced structures. So structures shape the way people act. Susan almost just said that a minute ago, right? And then people act, they reproduce and reconstitute those structures. They have a recursive, mutual, interactive relatedness. And we can see many examples of that. Susan's given us quite a few. And one I'm going to show you is structural violence. Structural violence, what is that? That's the coercive control that is the way we manifest the oppressive structure in our society, where we maintain control of the outcomes of social interaction, control of resources.
Joan.
And we do that, I'm sorry, this way, right?
No, speak louder. Yeah.
We do that by violence. We do that by violence. Violence, what does violence mean? Violence isn't just physical violence. Another meaning of the term, if you look in Webster's dictionary, is injury by infringement. So we infringe people's space, their opportunities, we infringe people's lives. And that is violence. The most, of course, egregious types of examples of structural violence. Here's police brutality. What happens when people experience this kind of violence? Well, they become angry, right? When you marginalize and hold people powerless, they become angry. Where does the anger go? It goes toward themselves. They get depressed. You say, oh, why are all these people so having mental health problems? Well, they're depressed because they're angry and they're turning it against themselves, or they turn it against other people. So we see that the structural violence maintains and creates intra and interpersonal violence. Then what happens when we have intra and interpersonal violence? More structural violence in response. You see the mutual interactive nature of this relationship. Now, Sewell will tell us that there are three principles that constitute structures. So structures are the principles that pattern social practice. And so what are structures, somebody said? Well, they are principles. They're virtual, okay? They have to be enacted to become real. They have to be instantiated to become real. But they exist. They're principles that pattern our practice. The first is schemas. First principle, schemas. The formal codes, the frames, the metaphors, the assumptions that we use when we enact our social life. Okay? The second is resources. The objects, human qualities, or knowledge that can be used to enhance or maintain power. And the third principle is modes of power. Modes of power specify which schemas are legitimate, who has access to resources, and they adjudicate contestations over these resources. So structures, then, are mutually sustaining schemas, modes of power, and resources that empower and constrain social action and tend to be reproduced by that action. So here we have like a schematic diagram of a structure, a structural form. This recursive enactment among these different principles constitutes the structure. So when we say that an element of a social system is structuralized, we mean it's significantly embedded in the schemas, resources, and modes of power in such a way that support, legitimate, and maintain racial norms. Schemas, the racialized norms of social interaction, conscious and unconscious bias. And resources, the racialized distribution of social goods. And then we have this mutual recursive interaction between them, which we could define as structural racialization. So we see that they interact in ways that produce social inequities and outcomes. Now, of course, structures pattern social action at a whole range of different levels and interact with one another. So we have many structural forms that contain these principles and embody and enact them, right? And some are more deeply layered, is the way it's referred to. Deeply layered means that they've been around a long time and that they have a broad effect across a whole range of social interaction. Many institutions are structural forms. They're often referred to as the rules of the game. But most institutions contain schemas, which are the rules and norms and everything, as well as power and resource sets. They're sets. They all are contained there. And some institutions are deeply layered. I have a picture of the New York Stock Exchange here. Very impressive building. And it has, metaphorically, it conveys right away the modes of power, the capitalist economy, the resources, the financial instruments that are traded and sold on the stock exchange, and the schemas. You see there's a big flag across the whole front of the building, and there's a sort of implication that our capitalist economy is what's driving our democracy and keeping us free, right? Liberty and justice for all. what I'd like you to see when you look at this set of the instantiation of these principles is the tension between them. You see right away that there's some tension between freedom and justice for all and the capitalist economy, right? and it's kind of covered over by the operation of the institution. This interactive nature of it isn't so smooth. It's full of tension, but it's kind of hidden from view. And it's kind of cute to look at this frieze over the top of the building. This frieze was built this building was built in 1903, and the frieze is intended to represent integrity, protecting the works of man. On one side, we have agriculture and mining, and on the other side, we have science and ingenuity and invention. And there are supposed to be little waves at the little edges, which indicate the ocean-to-ocean influence of the exchange. But I think as you look at it, it's immediately apparent that integrity is not what we associate with the stock exchange right now, right? We think of greed and financial manipulation, right? So you see the tensions between the different principles and how they're embodied and how they're thought about. So I've been emphasizing that structure is principles, and the way they're enacted is by actors. And there's a classic interface between structure and agency, structure and action. And when I talk about agency, I'm not just talking about people, individual people. I'm also talking about communities, social entities, communities, organizations, people, families, social entities. And we need to think about that because of this interface. Structures only shape practice, and so they only come into being when they're put into action. And this capacity for action is inherent in everybody. We all have a capacity for action. But it's shaped by the cultural schemas, the available resources, and the modes of power that we experience. That make sense? Right? Good. So that means that access to a sense of agency is a kind of confidence in one's ability to control some parts of the outcome of social interaction, and a flexibility in our response so that we can reinterpret cultural schemas. So that it's not a given, but there's certainly a very big effect of the structural factors when they are lived out in daily life. So even though all social actors have the capacity to exercise agency, social structures empower actors differentially, and so their freedom of access to a sense of agency will be differentially constrained. Well, they're supposed to represent some constraint on agency there. And very often we have the dominant episodic view of agency. Why don't people do things? It's because they don't know any better. They need more. They need to be motivated. They need to become responsible, take responsibility, right? Or even that they need more information and access. I've had plenty of clients over the years who've had lots of information and access and still did not act. Why didn't they act? Well, of course, sometimes they said, well, it won't make any difference what I do. But oftentimes, they didn't act partly because their lives were constrained in such a way that they were focused totally on the present moment, just to survive, and it was hard for them to see into the future or make plans. They didn't really think that way.